and recording to the cloud. There we go. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Water, Wetlands, and Watershed Seminar. Hello, everyone in the Zoom, everyone out there on YouTube. It's great to see you again. Today, we have Dr. Bret Webb speaking with us today, and I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Clark to do the introduction. So please go ahead, Mark.
All right. Thank you, David. Well, I'm very happy to introduce our speaker today, Bret Webb. As David just mentioned, Bret is a professor of coastal engineering at the University of South Alabama. His research interests fall within the broad topic of coastal resilience, which many of us have heard about and are going to learn a lot more about in a second. Bret's research currently focuses on two different aspects of coastal resilience: resilience of the built environment to extreme events, and how that resilience is enhanced through the use of natural and nature-based features. Bret is currently working on several nationwide projects related to nature and nature-based features like living shorelines, and is also co-editor of an upcoming book on living shorelines. So I'm sure those of you who are practitioners of living shorelines will be eager to see that. I know I am. But Bret also doesn't just do the academic side. He's actually a strong practitioner of it. He is a registered professional engineer in the state of Alabama and Florida, and often consults on living shorelines and other coastal engineering projects, and is endorsed by the Academy of Coastal, Ocean, Port, and Navigation Engineers as a board certified coastal engineer. So not only can he do the science, but he can actually put it into practice, or give that royal stamp, so to speak. And last but not least, Bret is a Gator through and through. He got all of his degrees here at the University of Florida in both civil and coastal engineering departments. So yeah, chomp away. So I also have a couple of projects that we're trying to collaborate with Bret on, and he might say something about his flume and some of the facilities he has there. So we're looking forward to working with him this summer. But with that, Bret, please take it away.
Thank you very, very much for that excellent introduction. And so hopefully we're going to drop into screen sharing mode, and I hope you're looking at the correct thing. So,
looks perfect. Yep.
Excellent. So yeah, we're going to talk through some of this stuff today about the use of natural nature-based features for coastal resilience, but I would be remiss if I didn't kind of provide a little bit of context for what we're about to talk about. And that is really acknowledging other people that I've been working with. And this is kind of a small cross-section of people, but these are the folks that were specifically related to this kind of exploratory work that we started doing about 4 or 5 years ago. So it's got a little bit of age on it, but it is timely and relevant because we're actually been asked to write a contributor review paper to a Cambridge Systems journal dedicated issue on this topic. And so that we're kind of going to put the team back together, so to speak, and wrap some of this stuff up into a journal publication soon. So Stephen Cyphers and Rebecca Linsky from Northeastern University, Rachel Gitman at East Carolina University, Shailesh Sharma, City College of New York, and then Dr. Juice Seabrian, who's moved from Dauphin Island Sea Lab over to Northern Gulf Institute, but at the time was at the Sea Lab. And then our project sponsor, which is U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Engineer Research and Development Center, in our context there, Julie Rosati and Glenn Merrick. So Mark kind of already did the introduction for me, but I think the biggest thing to note is the thing that he said maybe last, which is I'm a Gator. And so I'm really delighted to be speaking to a bunch of other Gators and everybody else that's listening in today, or we'll see this at some other time. I can't say enough good things about the time that I spent in Gainesville, all 10 years before I finally left. So I was kind of one of those people that goes into academia that does the thing that people say you should never do, which is receive all 3 degrees from the same institution. But as you all probably know by hanging out around there, there are few institutions in the United States, maybe in fact in the world, that provide coastal engineering education. Certainly not at the level that University of Florida does, and they do it very well. So legitimately, there was no reason for me to just go somewhere else because I'd really probably be doing myself a disservice. And to be perfectly honest, it really hasn't affected me professionally one way or another. But Mark also mentioned that I'm a practitioner too, and so you'll probably hear me kind of blur the lines in between academics and consulting a little bit. And I like to joke that I have a hat that I wear. On one side it says academic, on the other side it says practitioner. And based on what I'm doing that day, I just turn it around. And I also have one that says science on one side and policy on the other one. That one's also fun to wear, and it gets turned around a lot these days. But some people that I work with actually call me a pracademic, and I had never heard that before, but essentially it's a practical or practicing academic. And so I actually do spend quite a bit of time trying to take what we do on the research side and translate it into professional practice, both for my own selfish purposes, but also to the delight of many others, I guess. So some navigation as to where we're going today. I'm shamelessly showing the Gulf of Mexico because it's my home turf. I grew up in Fort Myers, Florida, and then spent time in Gainesville, and then now in Alabama. So really, I've never been able to escape the gravitational pull of the Gulf of Mexico, regardless of how weak it may be. It seems to keep me near it. So we can think of the presentation in three parts. We'll start with a little bit of background, which is mainly kind of setting the stage for why would we even be interested in natural nature-based features, and how does it relate within the context of coastal resilience, and what do those things mean? So a little bit of motivation and terminology before we get into the weeds, so to speak, which is kind of the second part, in talking about our review of the literature and a synthesis to kind of describe what are the general capabilities of these natural nature-based features. What can they do, and what can they be expected to do now and into the future? And then close with some thoughts on what we believe are still some fairly large knowledge gaps, maybe even like knowledge chasms that we seem to fall into, that we really need answers to. So first, just a little bit of background in terms of motivation. A fairly large percentage of the U.S. population lives in a coastal county in the United States. And that number goes up a bit if we think of people living in coastal watersheds, because sometimes those watersheds bridge, kind of inland counties that are, somewhat away from the coast proper. And the demand on resources in the coastal environment is increasing because of not only the number of people that live in these coastal areas, but the fact that these coastal areas are also growing faster than any other area in the United States. And the population densities are higher than anywhere else in the United States, broadly speaking. And so as a result, we have more people needing more stuff, leading to more investment in infrastructure in these coastal areas, which are also going to be the same areas that are impacted by future climate change and things like sea level rise. And so by putting more stuff in harm's way, we really develop our own need for that infrastructure and those people to be resilient to extreme events and the long-term impacts of climate change. And so thinking a little bit about terminology before we go too far, there are lots of different ways to describe or talk about natural and nature-based features. And you're going to hear lots of different terminology used depending on who's doing the speaking. Sometimes they're called coastal green infrastructure. Sometimes it's kind of partitioned into green versus gray infrastructure. Sometimes you'll hear nature-based solutions or living shorelines. Really, we're all kind of speaking the same language, but just with a slightly different, vernacular. So when we say natural features, we're really talking about things that are created or evolve over time through physical, biological, geological, or chemical processes. So these are natural systems that are created and function on their own without human input. But when we say nature-based feature, what we mean by that is, something that humans have done through science or engineering design to actually mimic the characteristics of natural features, but kind of in an intentional way. So this is where humans get involved in the natural system and try to either enhance or restore, replace, or somehow modify or mimic those natural systems. And sometimes we do a good job, and in other times we don't really do a good job at all. And when we talk about the combination of these two things, that really leads to this, this common framework by which we call natural nature-based features, or NNBF. And really, they exist kind of in this really weird, fuzzy area in between the fully natural systems and the fully engineered systems. And the way I like to think about it is we're using our engineering know-how to try and essentially build a better mousetrap, or replace the mousetrap that we lost. In so doing, we often don't stop to consider the ecological or geological context in which these systems exist, and in which these systems have evolved over time. And so the siloing of what we do in the coastal environment in terms of our work into like the engineering silo and the environmental silo and the regulatory silo and the financing silo, those silos need to be tipped over and all of the contents basically mixed together to do nature-based work, because it requires skill set from lots of different, groups of practitioners. This is not a case where we can essentially go it alone. These are systems where the engineering and the ecology really needs to be blended together in a very intentional way, not just as part of the chain of going through a project design of, okay, I've come up with my design, I'm going to hand it over to the environmental team, and then they're just going to bless it and move it on. It has to start much earlier in the process. And that also includes the regulatory professionals as well. They need to be involved very early in the process. What about resilience? What do we mean? Well, the classical definition of resilience, this is the other part of the presentation title, so I feel inclined to talk about it, is defined, at least here, as the ability to adapt to a changing condition or conditions and withstand and rapidly recover from disruptions due to disasters. But more recently, Maslink and Lazarus developed a maybe better definition for what coastal resilience really means. And that's the capacity of the socioeconomic and natural systems in the coastal environment to cope with disturbances induced by factors such as sea level rise, extreme events, human impacts, by adapting whilst maintaining their essential functions. And I like that one because classical definitions of resilience seem to treat a disrupting event as an impulse, like it's a one-time thing. But in the coastal environment, we deal with both the one-time things, which we might think of as kind of, acute stressors, but we also have to deal with the chronic stressors as well, and the background conditions in which we do our work, things like long-term sea level rise. So the classical definition, I guess, of a resilient system is where you've got some level of service or functionality or service state, and then an event happens, you lose that functionality, and then it recovers over time. And so a conventional system might recover slowly over time. And a resilient system might look like this. You've got, during that disruptive event, you've got a lower decrease in functionality or service, and you've got a quicker time to recovery. So that really speaks to the rapidity at which you are recovering from this event. And that kind of feeds directly into the definition of resilience. And so this change or reduction in time to which you can reach the same functionality after an event translates into, when you're thinking also about the fact that you're not sustaining as much damage. And it doesn't have to be money. It could be disruption. It could be impacts to the ecological, communities or habitats. But if you integrate those things over time, what you end up with is kind of a cumulative benefit of having a resilient system. So quicker time to recovery, less overall damage or loss of habitat or ecosystem function or service. And so why should we be resilient? And there are a couple of things that are really helpful to point out, which is there was an NRC study done back in 2014 that found that pre-disaster planning and mitigation can save communities about 75% of post-storm replacement or reconstruction costs. So that's a fairly huge saving. And then every dollar spent before an event saves $4 to $5 in reconstruction costs after. Those are basically saying the same thing. The other thing that we found in other studies is that the sooner you do your resilient adaptation, the more you benefit from that cost savings long term. So, basically mitigating future problems now through resilient adaptation ends up saving you a lot of money in the long run. And if not money, then other costs to habitat loss, costs to habitat fragmentation, whatever it is. We're also going to talk, some in this presentation about risk and vulnerability. And so the simplest definition of a risk that I can give is thinking about this as the probability of damage or something occurring multiplied by the consequences of that damage. And that leads to risk. Now, the probability of damage because of climate change is likely to change over time. So there's been an assumption over most of modern history that we operate kind of in a stationary type environment where the hazard at the beginning of the project life is going to be the same as the hazard at the end of the project life, and that's just not true anymore. And so with increases in sea level or increases in mean temperature of the ocean or the atmosphere or ocean acidification or whatever the issue is, the probability of something happening is going to change over time. Not necessarily always go up, it could go down, but things are changing. If we also think about the fact that we're investing more in infrastructure in hazardous areas to support the people's needs, then the consequences of damage can also be thought to be changing over time and no longer static. And so when you multiply these two things, you get a really interesting change in risk over the life of a project or whether it's infrastructure or habitat, whatever it is. Now, in terms of vulnerability, it's kind of some weird combination of three things: your exposure to an event, your sensitivity to that event, and also your adaptive capacity or your ability to kind of respond to that event. And exposure really speaks to risk. So the thing that we were just focusing on the last slide. And sensitivity really speaks to the resilience of the system. So how much of an event can it withstand, whether it's chronic or acute? And then adaptive capacity kind of speaks to the robustness of the system and also whether that system has any kind of inherent redundancy. And the reason why we're kind of, as a professional community, thinking about natural nature-based features as part of a systems approach to managing risk at the coast is because, unlike our traditional engineering infrastructure, that when it's designed, unless it's specifically designed to be adapted over time, is very difficult to do without a lot of expense and a lot of engineering muscle, so to speak. Whereas natural nature-based features, they have some inherent capacity to adjust to a changing condition. So whether that's long-term sea level rise or changes in water quality or circulation, whatever they are, they do have some inherent adaptive capabilities. And so if we can think about implementing these into the system to not do all of the work to reduce the risk, but to do some of it, we've got a system that, if designed appropriately and managed appropriately, will hopefully have its own inherent adaptive capacity, whereas our traditional infrastructure really doesn't. So the role of natural nature-based features in coastal risk reduction and resilience really is kind of maybe summarized in these two graphics, where we compare conventional infrastructure to NNBF. So, on the plus side, conventional infrastructure at the coast for managing risk does generally provide a lot of risk reduction, but only for the conditions to which it was designed to handle. And they are generally robust, very kind of engineered, big type gray solutions. But it turns out that these big solutions also have a lot of inherent sensitivity. When they fail, they tend to fail catastrophically and really don't provide any kind of functionality after they're damaged. And generally, they don't provide a lot of inherent redundancy unless it's specifically integrated into the design. Contrast that against the natural nature-based features, where they tend to be more resilient to changing stressors. They're certainly more adaptable in the sense that they adapt on their own under some conditions. And I wouldn't say, based on what we learn in the literature, that they provide overall a risk reduction under all scenarios, but they do provide effective risk management, especially for kind of like the chronic background stressors that we deal with on the day-to-day basis. But it turns out also that in many cases, they're not necessarily that robust, in a sense that there is a threshold beyond which these natural nature-based features, whether it's sea level rise or ocean acidification or eutrophication, that these systems just cannot keep up with anymore without a lot of human intervention. So what we were seeking to do is really kind of look at the ability or the capabilities really of things like marshes, mangroves, seagrasses, coastal maritime forests, oysters and coral reefs and other shellfish reefs, dunes, beaches, barrier islands, these things that we classically think of as either natural features or through a little bit of engineering ingenuity, nature-based features, and what they provide in terms of risk reduction at the coast. What are the things that they can actually do? And the reason why we did this is because there are lots of kind of fanciful things published in the literature and in maybe the gray literature as well that may be misconstrued. So we've seen lots of statements like these natural nature-based features are NNBF, they eliminate storm surge, they stop erosion, they require no maintenance, it can outpace sea level rise, it sequesters carbon and it will even sharpen your knives. So there's some fake news associated with what these NNBF can actually do. And so we kind of wanted to separate like fact and fiction. So what can these systems actually achieve in terms of managing risk in coastal hazards? And the reason why we might want to do this is that, you know, overall there's a trend along the coast as we urbanize our coastal environment and as we essentially develop the uplands. The trend is to harden and defend the shoreline, not only because of erosion, but what we also see then as sea level rise that's starting to cause inundation of the upland. Of course, this leads to a loss of intertidal habitat over time where, you know, any kind of shoreline armoring, if given enough time, will generally eliminate the intertidal slope in front of it, just due to wave reflection, inducing a lot of scour and a lowering of the bed elevation in front of that armoring. Obviously then leading to loss of ecological benefits and really a loss of biodiversity in front of the armored shorelines. And we see this a lot happening in what we call low fetch environments. So these are generally semi-sheltered, semi-enclosed water bodies that are not very large, whose wave conditions really are not all that energetic, you know, on a consistent basis. But these are the places that are more developed. And these are also the shorelines that unfortunately are easier to defend with natural systems, but generally are defended with hard armoring instead. And so really what we're looking for is kind of an enhancement of, you know, or a new paradigm for managing these easy to defend shorelines. So the second part I said was going to really focus on the capabilities, and we did a much broader study, and I'm going to try and boil this down and kind of give you the abridged version, so to speak. So we're just going to kind of focus on the highlights, and we're not really going to have time to go into every single one of those NNBF type features in this presentation. But essentially what we did was, you know, you could call it maybe a glorified literature synthesis, or, you know, now we're trying to move this more to a meta-analysis. We're actually extracting quantitative data from the papers. But we just tried to wrap our arms around the literature that actually had performance type data presented in a way that we could kind of clearly understand what was done, how were those data collected, how are the measurements described, how are the capabilities described, things of that nature. For these different types of NNBF. So for wetlands and tidal marshes, we came up with about 70 papers that we thought actually had kind of actionable, good information about the ability of intertidal marshes or wetlands to actually kind of reduce some coastal hazards, whether it's changing water levels or velocities or damping wave energy or stabilizing shorelines and sediments. There's obviously a much larger, you know, group of papers than just 70 that deal with wetlands and intertidal marshes in the coastal environment. But if you really get down to brass tacks, there's fewer and fewer papers that actually provide specific quantitative information about these capabilities. And so, you know, one of the interesting things that we found in doing this really is that what we believe wave, you know, like the wave attenuating capabilities of intertidal marshes, they do have very strong wave attenuating capabilities when they're emergent, but when they're submerged during periods of high water, say during extreme events, their benefits actually shift more from wave attenuation to surge reduction and reduction of velocity. And the reason why is just how these processes are interacting with the vegetation, but also how the vegetation is responding to these forces. And so when the water levels are low and waves are kind of traveling through the more rigid parts of the vegetation down low by the root mat, you get basically a lot of form drag and scattering of the wave energy. So it's very effective attenuator of wave energy. But as that water level goes up and you're getting to the thinner diameter portion, the more flexible portion of vegetation, that vegetation starts to move, and it's thinner, so its drag is not as, its form drag isn't as impactful for wave attenuation, but it is for things like surge and velocity reduction, because essentially, you know, or any kind of velocity reduction or surge reduction is going to be related to essentially the drag force, which is proportional to velocity squared. So if you can change the velocity just a little bit through a reduction, through essentially the interaction of just the physical presence of the marsh vegetation, but also the fact that now it's got an inertial response to the flowing water, that even a small change in velocity leads to a big change in the drag force. And so that ends up being very effective at attenuating some of this energy. Now, interestingly enough, violent storms and hurricanes generally contribute less than about 1% to long-term salt marsh erosion rates, but frequently occurring storm events drive most of the observed erosion. So salt marshes actually are really more susceptible to changes in mean wave energy over long periods of time as compared to intense but infrequent storms. And they do have quite a bit of capacity to survive these events because they're generally submerged during the extreme events. So the underlying morphology in the root mat is fairly protected. One of the major problems really is not the high water condition, it's the low water condition where waves basically eat at the edge of the root mat and can undermine it and lead to fairly large failures of that root mat in clumps along the edge. And they also have some very strong ecological benefits as well, but we're really just focusing on the hazard type reductions. So if we were to look at, kind of a change in water level during a marsh as the tide's coming in, this is a picture of a intertidal marsh in a bay on Long Island Sound, and it's about an 8-foot tide range. So at low tide, the marsh is completely dry. And as the water level comes up, you're starting to get some really strong wave attenuation benefits as the waves are traveling through that marsh. And then as the tide continues to rise, you're starting to kind of change the benefits more from wave attenuation to surge and velocity reduction. Interestingly enough, at least in kind of our part of the world, the seasonal growth of a marsh corresponds with our hurricane season. So really by the peak of hurricane season, most of our intertidal marsh grasses have actually reached kind of mostly full density and mostly full height. So there's a really interesting analog in between the marsh growth patterns and also their capability to actually, provide some risk reduction during extreme events. We also found quite a bit of literature on mangroves, not as much as we did on the intertidal marshes, but we found at least 25 papers that actually had some good quantitative information. And really mangrove forests and other types of maritime or coastal forests of relatively dense composition are really effective at attenuating storm surge and in some cases small to medium tsunamis. And this is found across lab, field, and also numerical experiments. Really, because storm surge generally and things like sea level rise and tides, they tend to rise and fall relatively slowly, relatively speaking. And so as a result, they really can't generate a lot of velocity, and therefore you don't get a lot of drag benefit. But with mangroves, that changes a little bit just because of the structural characteristics of mangroves. You've got this really complex root system down low. You've then got like the more vertical, sparsely spaced trunks, but then you've got this really complex canopy at the top. So as the water level is changing with respect to the structure of a mangrove, its benefits and what it's capable of doing are also changing. Interestingly enough, almost across all studies, they found that faster moving storms, so the faster that water was moving, the faster the storm surge was rising, the more energetic the wave conditions were, that things like these mangrove forests really had much greater benefits to overall reductions in flooding levels and velocities, and also wave action, just because of this interaction in the form drag. Some studies found decay rates of surge through mangrove forests as high as about 0.5 meter per kilometer. And so there are benefits, but the scale of the benefits are not really recouped unless you have a fairly large stand of mangroves. And the same could be true of intertidal marshes. They do provide, surge reduction benefits, but it requires a really big marsh. And for, intertidal marshes, that number is not 0.5 meter per kilometer. It's something like 10 or 20 centimeters per kilometer. So does it have a benefit? Yes. But does it work equally as well at all spatial scales? The answer is absolutely no. Mangroves have some other really interesting benefits as well because of their complex root structure and canopy structure, where they provide more measurable benefits for reducing wave setup and wave runup, and in many cases mitigating tsunami runup and damage. And even patchy clumps of mangrove can reduce momentum fluxes by as much as 80% in some cases. So the answer with a lot of the vegetation species is yes, but it depends. And it depends on how densely they're spaced, how big they are spatially speaking in terms of the stand or the area. And the same can be said of coastal or maritime forests as well. In some cases, you do see fairly strong wave attenuation of velocity and flood reduction. But in many cases, this is kind of a biased way to look at NNBF because the presence of the maritime forest or the coastal forest displaces a lot of your built infrastructure. And so as a result, the impacts you see are a lot less just because the infrastructure is not there. But really, in the case of pretty much all maritime forests, the type of species in the forest is not really that important. It's really the presence or the absence that is more of an indicator of whether you're going to get a flood reduction or a wave attenuation benefit or a velocity reduction. The other interesting thing is that, and this is almost true across all vegetation species that are emergent, is that most of your benefits in terms of hazard reduction are, basically found over the first, tens of meters of that stand of vegetation, and then doubling or tripling or even quadrupling the size of that stand of vegetation doesn't lead to a doubling, tripling, or quadrupling of the benefits. So it's extremely non-linear behavior, and the decay is exponential as you go through the stand of vegetation. So you really do get most of your benefits over the leading edge. We also found some really interesting information about how patchy vegetation affects mean flow, and also then things like sediment transport and erosion and deposition, where if you have essentially a patch of vegetation, and it could be mangroves, marsh, it doesn't really matter, even seagrasses, you have waves approaching this patch of vegetation. The waves are essentially allowed to propagate past the vegetation relatively unimpeded, but then are dissipated through the vegetation. So as a result, you end up with a change in the time average water level where it's lower through the vegetation and higher on the sides. And this induces a change in mean circulation where you get onshore directed flow outside of the vegetation and return flow or seaward directed flow inside of the vegetation. And so all of that changes sediment transport patterns and erosion and deposition along the coast. We also looked at lots of papers on, the capabilities and benefits of oyster and other shellfish reefs. And really here, what we were expecting to find an overwhelming abundance of positive literature reinforcing, the ability of oyster reefs to attenuate waves. We actually found much fewer quantitative papers than we had expected. And we found examples of intertidal reefs and subtidal reefs and some information about how these oyster reefs, whether natural or constructed actually provide wave attenuating benefits. And in fact, they do. But what was interesting is that the kind of mutual success of having an oyster reef that is very effective at attenuated wave energy, but is also very effective at larval recruitment and long-time growth, are sometimes at odds with one another. So we don't always find good combinations of success when those two things are goals and you try and accomplish them with one specific application or treatment. But we did find, lots of examples in the literature where the removal of historical, either subtidal or intertidal oyster reefs have led to tremendous increases in wave energy reaching the shoreline, which then obviously leads to changes in shoreline erosion and long-term retreat. But we know that oyster reefs, like coral reefs, can provide quite a bit of wave attenuation benefits, and then also do things like reducing flooding associated with wave run-up along the coast because they are actively reducing those wave heights. Coral reefs are really phenomenal in the sense that just how much energy they dissipate. And if anybody has seen waves breaking on a coral reef, say like on the north shore of Hawaii, you get a real impression for just how phenomenal these systems are, in a sense that you have a 30-foot wave before it gets to this coral reef, and you get very little wave run up on the beach after that wave breaks, and there's almost no presence of the wave signature at all. And this is because waves can really reduce the incident wave, or coral reefs can reduce incident wave energy by essentially 97%. And the reef crest alone dissipates about 80% of that energy. So they're fairly phenomenal. And one of the reasons why is because their spatial scale is a lot larger relative to the wavelength than some of our oyster reef restoration that we're trying to do to achieve these kind of similar wave attenuation benefits. But like other things, they are vulnerable to long-term climate change and specifically ocean acidification. We also looked at dunes, and there are a lot of papers that talk about dunes, but not a lot of papers that talk about the quantitative benefits of risk reduction related to dunes. But it's also one of the only NNBF that we have where we actually have a risk-based kind of design approach for designing the geometry and the volume of a dune to withstand a specific event. We don't really have that type of design formula for a lot of these other NNBF. But really the things that dictate the performance of a dune are its crest elevation and the volume of sediment above the still water level during an event. But in all cases, the presence of vegetation on a dune greatly reduced the overall erosion. And it also changes the sediment transport patterns in terms of whether that sediment is lost to the offshore or whether it's moved across the land surface through an overwash process. But like beaches, dunes and beaches and their combinations are known to be very effective risk management systems, or NNBF, along the coast. We have lots of examples in the published literature after extreme events like Sally and others that really speak to this. And so there was a few papers done and a few studies done after Hurricane Sally and kind of the residential New Jersey coast that looked at the disparity of damage to upland infrastructure when it was behind a wide beach and a tall dune versus when it wasn't. And the results were very eye-opening to many non-coastal practitioners. They were really surprised by the fact that these homes that were behind these managed beaches and dunes really had very little wave-related damage, and it was mainly just flooding-related damage. Whereas structures that weren't were completely destroyed. And it's really because the beach and the dune system is there as a sacrificial natural system for dissipating the wave energy and trying to slow down or control this erosive effect during the extreme event. But in all cases, wider beaches and taller dunes led to less damage. But the other thing that beaches and dunes, well, mainly beaches, do is that when you can't move the upland infrastructure inland, you can get a similar level of risk reduction or resilience benefit by moving the shoreline seaward by an equivalent amount. And this kind of dates back to studies that were done in the 80s and the 90s. And then also a few papers related to the presence of barrier islands. Now, these are weird types of experiments to do because We can't just go physically remove a barrier island and see what happens. And in many cases, we haven't been tracking or monitoring data during the active loss of barrier islands. So primarily the papers that we found were essentially numerical modeling experiments, many of which are on the Louisiana coast, where we do have barrier islands and intertidal marsh systems that are disappearing fairly rapidly. So it was really a numerical experiment to see, well, what if these barrier islands weren't maintained and what if they disappeared? And the modeling results were pretty much as you would expect, that if you take away, really the barrier islands demonstrate some capacity to reduce storm surge and waves by as much as 10 to 25%, depending on the scenario and the location. And really, alternatively, the complete disappearance of the barrier island would lead to tremendous ecological changes to the system behind it. But we do have some gaps in our knowledge and our technical know-how. And mainly these can be summarized in terms of like no unified approach for doing any of this. Now we do have some information I'm about to allude to in the next slide, but we still don't have a lot of good, we don't have a systematic framework by which we design NNBF. In many cases in the published literature, it's very helpful, but in some cases, their methodologies that were used to collect the data or express or analyze the data are unclear. There's lots of, kind of interchangeable uses between kind of attenuating wave heights versus attenuating wave energy. And those are two very different things because energy is proportional to wave height squared. So if you see somebody say, oh, well, it reduces the energy by 90%, that sounds pretty fantastic, but it may actually not reduce the wave height. Certainly doesn't reduce the wave height by 90%. In many cases, published literature generally ignores the underlying impact of morphology on wave or surge or flooding or velocity reductions, and the fact that there's friction in the system and changes in water depth inherently lead to changes in some of these processes. And generally, the papers only look at the presence or absence of the vegetation or the oyster reef and kind of ignore in many cases some of these other the issues. And really also the site-specific nature about a lot of this work leads to some uncertainty. There is existing information related to NNBF and really exists kind of at the federal level, at the state level, and also kind of in the academic level. And now starting to get into the practitioner level as well. But the Corps has a number of, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has a number of good documents related to NNBF. Some of this, at least early on, came out of the earlier I was saying Hurricane Sally for the beaches and dunes. I actually meant Hurricane Sandy. Most of the NNBF stuff that's come out lately from the Corps of Engineers was actually inspired by the post-Sandy studies that were done related to coastal resilience. A couple of years ago, I worked on this project with the Federal Highway Administration, U.S. Department of Transportation, to publish a guide for transportation practitioners to look at implementing nature-based solutions for improving their highway resilience. And then most recently, the Corps of Engineers published these international guidelines on natural nature-based features, but it's still not a technical guide to designing these things. It really focuses on implementation and capabilities, which is great, but we still don't have a unified system for actually designing these NNBF. And there's one of the reasons why is there's just a lot of uncertainty still that remains in how these systems respond. They're natural systems, so there is a lot of uncertainty or natural variation in how they react or interact in the coastal environment. And some of this is habitat and species dependent. Some of the uncertainty is related to how data are collected in the field or the lab. But one of the things that we might be able to do is really find a way to incorporate this uncertainty into the design in a way where we kind of aim for inherent redundancy in the system and the ability for it to respond. But generally what we found in reviewing the literature is that the number one stressor is generally us. So we're impacting the system in a way where the existing habitats are really having a hard time adapting to a changing condition. And it's really the cumulative impacts over time that are affecting them more than the more acute extreme events. So just some key points to close off with. We really set out to kind of wrap our arms around and find as much literature as we could, that quantitative evidence that we could understand about how the data were collected and analyzed and described in ways that evaluate the capacity of these systems to, reduce risk along the coast. And it turns out that in some cases, you get considerable reductions of these hazards, but in all cases, combinations generally work best. So it's kind of a belt and suspenders approach to NNBF, but that there are significant technical gaps that we still need to overcome. And this is really where research comes in. So the research is going to be what fills these knowledge gaps and what ultimately leads to changes in professional practice. So Mark said that we do have a book. Now people are going to joke, may laugh when they see this because they've heard me talking about this for a long time. This has taken a long time to close out, but we are very close to the end now, and we expect it to be done this year, where we have a book on living shorelines, where we got groups of people, writing teams in different regions around the country to write chapters that are specific to their region. But it's got kind of a national context, and then initially, and then regional chapters, case studies, and some lessons learned. So hopefully you'll actually see that in print this year. And I'm actually myself working on a few NNBF projects right now. Mark alluded to earlier some crossover between the two of us and how we got connected. And it was really through a homeowner project over on Santa Rosa Sound in the Florida Panhandle. We've got a couple of small scale homeowner projects going on over there. It's not really a big part of what we do. For us, the risk reward ratio is skewed way too much on the risk side to get involved in a lot of these homeowner projects because our liability is perpetual. And the engineering fee to help a homeowner do a living shoreline is relatively low. So generally we get involved in, on the practitioner side on much bigger projects. We've got a 15,000 foot long project across 3 different sites over in Pensacola Bay that we're working on for Escambia County in collaboration with Naval Air Station Pensacola. And that'll lead to the creation of hundreds of acres of intertidal marsh and about 15,000 feet of reef for finfish and shellfish. We're working on a 1 million cubic yard restoration project on the east end of Dolphin Island to restore beach and dune habitat there and to protect a bird sanctuary and a freshwater aquifer. And then interestingly, we've got some NNBF projects in the Pacific, 2 in American Samoa that was funded through a NIFWIF grant for community resilience and working on a locally preferred alternative or an LPA for shoreline stabilization and protection of Beach Road in the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands on the island of Saipan. So a little bit of geographic diversity to what's going on. And that's it. So I'm more than happy to answer questions.
All right. Thanks very much, Bret. A round of applause, virtual or otherwise. All right, David, I don't know. Do we have any questions in the virtual world or?
Let's see. We got nothing in the chat at the moment, so we'll open it up to the room. I'll go over and look at YouTube, but if there's anyone in the room that would like to ask Dr. Webb a question, go for it.
I'll kick things off. Either way, thanks, Bret. I really appreciate the presentation and to contextualize a lot of the, components that we always hear about, the resilience, the redundancy and whatnot, but you kind of frame that into a really nice package. And my specific question is, with the uncertainty and the big gaps, especially as an engineer that gets to stamp the plans, how do you deal with that uncertainty? And, the only way we move forward to kind of gain knowledge is to be implementing things, because sometimes it all can't be tested in advance. But as an engineer, you kind of have these more well-tested features, seawalls, whatnot, which we know have a certain engineering parameterization that's already about them, but we also know have those limitations. But then we try to look at these alternatives that we really don't have the development of those either time or quantitative assessments. I'm curious from a practitioner standpoint, how do you kind of wrestle with that uncertainty? You already talked about the long-term liabilities, especially at these homeowner scales and whatnot. Just throw that out there.
That's a great question. And that liability exists regardless of the project. So, anytime I get involved as a practitioner, which is why the university only lets me teach engineering. They don't let me practice engineering because then they're liable for my actions. But on the practitioner side, my liability is perpetual. So even when I'm no longer practicing engineering, anything that I've affixed my engineering stamp or seal to, I am liable for. So I'll carry errors and omissions insurance for the rest of my life until my dying days. So we do have to think very carefully before we put that stamp or seal on anything. And really what it comes down to is, there's a lot of what we do in engineering design is specification-based design. So if you're thinking about how your home is built, or how the office building that you're sitting in right now, or, the bridge that you drive over, those are known materials with known behaviors when a force or a load is applied. We don't necessarily have that in the natural environment. And so what I like to think about instead of specification-based design is functional design and performance-based design. So what does the function need to be, and how will it perform over time, both due to the chronic and the acute events. So some of the things that we like to do are, if we're going to have a real structural component, like a breakwater to reduce wave energy, to allow that breakwater to, essentially be resilient over time, we don't think about how to design at the beginning of the period of performance. We look to the end of the period of the performance and we think, okay, what are the conditions at the site going to be at the end of the 20, 30, or 50-year expected life of this project? And we design for that condition. And that does two things. Number one, you might argue that, well, you're overbuilding it initially. Yes, that's true, but you're also buying capacity to deal with more extreme events. So you're not really losing anything, you're gaining resilience early. And so you can almost think of like you've got your peak resilience early in the project life, and then you hit your target resilience by the end. And so that's easy to do with structural materials like rock. So we can size the rock to be slightly bigger to withstand conditions at the end of the period of performance as opposed to just the beginning. We can design it to be the crest elevation to be a little bit higher than we might need to allow for sea level rise over the life of the project. We might also leave the crest of that structure wider at the top to allow the client to come back and place additional stone on the top to keep pace with sea level rise, since a stone breakwater has no adaptive capacity on its own. It requires human intervention. But you can think of other things to do with the natural components too, like with marsh habitat. In this Pensacola Bay Living Shoreline project, we're creating hundreds of acres of marsh habitat in the middle of open water. And so instead of just having one species at one elevation, thinking about, okay, well, if I create a platform and basically have a diversity of species early in the project and a lot of elevation for lower elevation species to migrate to a sea level rise, then you're actually building in adaptive capacity to your project so that the whole thing doesn't just drown in place. So you have to be willing to accept flexibility over the life of the project and the fact that things might change. So at the beginning, we might have 3 different species of, marsh grasses at 3 different tidal datums, but over time, it might turn into a monoculture because sea level rise is going to get to the top of the platform. It's okay. You're still going to have an intertidal marsh. It's just going to be one species instead of 2 or 3. So thinking about things like that and, providing opportunities for the natural system to respond and adapt to changing conditions. So not doing things like putting a very thin marsh in front of a wall. So it's just going to drown in place. Marsh isn't going to migrate over the wall. So you have to think through these different things. And the other thing, which is going to sound a little bit like a cop-out, is getting people to accept shorter design lives. Mm-hmm. We know that with fairly good certainty what our sea level rise projections are going to do out to the year 2050. And those generally design a lot of the decision making for our coastal projects, whether it's designing a structure or thinking about species that are tidal datum sensitive. Mm-hmm. And so those are the things that drive design. We've got good certainty in a fairly narrow threshold, even from extreme planning event scenario for sea level rise all the way down to the low scenario. But after 2050, they all diverge. Mm-hmm. And so that's where the uncertainty gets very large. So getting people to think about, for natural systems, hey, don't expect 50 or 100 years of function. Expect 15, 20, or 30 years of function, and then go back and adaptively manage the system after that.
All right, thank you, David.
Thanks, Brett. Does that motivate some, I know you identified a bunch of research gaps, and of course you called them chasms, and they're quite broad. And so thinking about the students on the call who are designing their PhDs at this time, or thinking about getting into a career of research, the uncertainty that you mentioned varied from like the leaf blade and the form drag scale to the patch to the like, do you have some specific areas where you might focus people on, like the most the ripest research gap to pluck at this moment? Where should people be spending their effort?
So that's a great question. And I think the answer is more from a systems approach. So we've got a lot of research that looks at each one of these independent scales on its own, but we have a whole lot less research that tries to include the function of everything together as a system. And so like the presence or combinations of different NNBF together, which we commonly see in nature, like an intertidal or subtidal oyster reef in front of a marsh. So don't just think about the benefit of one or the other, think of the cumulative benefits of the entire system. Because the system benefits also from an ecological standpoint, the overall habitat performance, the ecosystem services are maximized when you have more than one thing on its own. And there are studies that actually show this, where if you have a marsh by itself and an oyster reef by itself, they have known benefits, but if you put them together, the benefits are more than the sum of each component. So I think what we're suffering from is, like I mentioned early in the presentation, like a siloing of expertise in projects. We're also siloing our research into, I'm just going to look at like form drag on a seagrass blade, and I'm going to look at patchy vegetation. But what we need to do is figure out collaborative ways to get everyone together to look at the system response and how it all adds up to a cumulative benefit or impact overall.
It's just harder to isolate the variables when you do that, because but I agree. I mean, it just compounding the number of factors that could influence that holistic component. So yeah. Do we have any other questions before we let Bret go? Anything online, David? We're good? You're muted.
We got a quiet YouTube group, so I guess that's it. I just remind everyone that next week we have another seminar. Where is it?
Spring break.
It's spring break. Oh, great. Everyone enjoy spring break. And then when we come back on the 16th, we've got Mark Hensel from VIMS talking about climate change and invasive species at the near shore. So another coastal talk. Let's give another round of applause to Bret. Thanks so much for coming and sharing with us today, and good luck filling those gaps.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Bret.